Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I am Jamie Moeller, and this is the Grad Connection. Again, my goal is to try to help graduate students do more than survive. I want to see you thrive. And so, last few weeks I've been doing this teaching assistant series. Have had several people comment on it and so forth privately and all that. So hopefully you find it useful. So continuing that thread, what I want to do today is talk about course objectives. And I think oftentimes, at least in my mind, I think course objectives get overlooked when people are developing courses. To me, one of the very first things, if I were looking at a course, is one of the very first things that I look at. So I guess the first question is, why do I think they matter? Well, to me, I guess the course objectives really provide kind of, what is the target or what is the direction for the course. When they're well written, they really do help people understand, what are the takeaways from the course, what am I going to learn, and that kind of thing. But I think sometimes because the reason they're overlooked is because they're often poorly written, or worse yet, there's no alignment in the course relative to those objectives, and I'll talk about what I mean by that here in a few minutes. So what do I mean by objectives? So these are, and these are kind of my words, I was jotting down some ideas of how I would describe these things. So to me, they are action statements that kind of outline what are the skills, knowledge, or abilities that you're going to gain from the course. And so that's first and foremost is that they are first of all, action statements. And so they basically oftentimes they'll start with a verb of some sort, discover this, or to understand that, to demonstrate this. They're usually action verbs that kind of at least are integrated into the statement, if not the beginning of the statement. Second, and I'm kind of drawing upon my experience of being in curriculum design and those kinds of things, course objectives are going to tell you where you're going, how you're going to get there, and how you know you're going to arrive. And so this broaches over into or reaches over into what I talk about as far as alignment. So what I mean by alignment is that there's alignment that the objectives and the activities and the assessments all line up together, right? So the objectives should be kind of the target for the course. The activities should be the what you're doing to try to get those knowledge, skills, and abilities. And then there should be an assessment to determine, okay, did you get those? And the assessment, activities could be anything from writing papers to doing something in a lab to, there's a wide range of things that activity could be. But to me, the key is alignment between objectives, activities, and assessment. And where sometimes things will get out of whack is when the stated goals or the stated objectives for a course are X, and the activities and usually the activities will align, right? Usually the activities will line up to those objectives, but it's usually one of the two ends that's either off. Either the objectives are misaligned to the assessment, or the assessment is misaligned to the objective, or maybe the assessment is just a poor way to judge, whether the person has reached that particular thing. So when I talk about alignment, that's what I'm talking about. Now, another thing that we taught that often comes up, and I didn't write this down, but I'm going to go ahead because it comes to mind as I'm talking about this. Oftentimes, your objectives may be, you may have objectives that outline different levels of ability. And so, now actually, before I get there, let me backtrack. So where you're going, in other words, that's the action statement. How you're going to get there is usually the activities. And then how you know you'll arrive, that's the assessment, right? So where are you going? How are you going to get there? And so you typically try to write that in a single statement. It can sometimes become cumbersome if you get too mechanical about it. But what I would say is try to keep the statements pretty brief, but hopefully you can get very direct to the point on that. So anyway, where I was going with that second point, so as I talk about, and I just lost the point that I was gonna. I do this oftentimes when I teach. It's like I interrupt myself and then I forget what I was gonna say. But nevertheless, we want alignment, and oftentimes there's not alignment. Oh, I know where I was going now. It usually comes to me after a few minutes. I was talking about different levels of objectives, right? So if you're talking about like a 100 level course, versus a 400 level course. Obviously, there's going to be progression in difficulty and so forth, but we oftentimes talk about, kind of like the like introductory types of information, or kind of like you go from an introductory to an intermediate to a mastery level. Sometimes in a particular course or whatever, you may end up having different levels of objectives. So that's, again, to me, this is kind of like the third dimension as you're looking at this, is like understanding, trying to separate those who really have mastery of a skill, of knowledge, or of ability versus those that are kind of at an intermediate level or whatever. So that's another kind of way to look at objectives. Now, the third thing that I want to talk about relative to the objective is like scope and how many. There is no magic number of how many objectives you should have. I mean, and there's a balance point. Because if you end up having too many objectives, you're probably shooting at too granular of a level, and it can get very cumbersome, right, to actually track all that. On the other side, if you have too few, it doesn't provide an accurate representation of what the course is actually going to cover. I'll be honest, and this has just been my experience, and I use it as a squish. I'd call it a squishy gauge. In most cases, when I have a 16-week, 3 credit hour course, I usually try to write anywhere between 5 and 10 objectives. So if you, and to me, it's easier to think about, okay, I want to limit myself to 5 to 10 things. How do I pick out the most important 5 to 10 things? And if you kind of think that way, you start to get a gauge for at what level you're writing the objectives. Because again, if you get too granular, you're going to have too many. If you're too high, it's too vague. And so that's my gauge. You take that with a grain of salt to see. There may be people that would disagree with that approach, but that's kind of my sense and kind of how I've approached it as an instructor, as a professor, whatever. So you want to be high enough, but you don't want to be low enough. And so there's a balance point, and some of that comes with experience. So I would just encourage you to, experiment with that. Now, the last thing I want to kind of talk about is that objectives, as I'm describing them here, are useful beyond just like course. I mean, in courses is where we kind of focus, particularly when you're an instructor. This is kind of one of the places you focus, but we also see this play out in a lot of other ways. So you could see this play out, if we go a level up, we could look at objectives as it relates to an entire curricula. And so when you lay out curricular, when you're doing curriculum design, when you're designing a program, this is one of the things that you actually try to do, is you try to jump up to that next level and talk about what are those macro things, if you will, that you want people to accomplish. Sometimes those macro elements are going to be driven maybe by things such as accreditation. So essentially accreditation is it's basically a mechanism by which an external entity comes in and says that you're doing what you say you are doing. And usually there's a review process. And there's actually multiple levels of accreditation, right? So you have something called regional accreditation, which, as its name describes, would be large regions. And so, the institution that I'm at, the Higher Learning Commission is kind of the regional accreditation that we use. And there are multiple ones of these, and most academic institutions basically participate, I'd say all of them participate in regional accreditation, because it's one of the measures that kind of gives an institution credibility. Now, I will say that regional accreditation usually looks at the institution as a whole. Does it have the resources to do what it says it does, and how does it support all of those things? When we talk about specialized accreditation, that usually is specific to a specific discipline. So the fields that I come out of, ABET accreditation is an engineering-oriented accreditation. There's ABBE, which is a flight-oriented accreditation, and there's all different kinds. But my whole point is, most of the things that drive those accreditation programs are based on something called outcomes. To me, outcomes are not that much different than objectives. You're just writing them at a higher level. To me, it's basically the same thing. Now, some would argue with me about that as well, but I'll say this idea of being able to write objectives or outcomes, or whatever word you want to use it, this idea of where you go and how you're going to get there, and how will you know that you arrived, that concept is at multiple levels in academic institutions. We're talking, this video is predominantly about the course, but if you get good at doing it in a course, then at a macro level, you could do it in a program. Now, if we go one step lower, I think it also applies when you're doing individual talks or lectures. Oftentimes, I've attended lectures or talks, and it's kind of like I walk out of the talk thinking, okay, what was that all about? What was the main takeaways? Anytime I'm designing a lecture or a talk, I try, and this is just my approach, I try to get it to 3 to 5, takeaways. Sometimes I'll just narrow it down to what is the one, like if you're doing a 20-minute, and this is a lot of times when you're presenting academic papers, you only have 20 minutes, right? And so in 20-minute period, you're not going to get 3 to 5. You may get one. And so it just depends on the kind of talk or the kind of presentation that I'm doing, but I would structure it such that it's easy for people to understand and you're leading them through the topic. And these objectives, these takeaways, if you will, are the things that oftentimes drive that. And so you can greatly improve your presentation skills just by focusing on sorting, labeling, and there's actually, I'll put in the put into the notes here. I bring up some material from a guy named Tom Henschel, who he focuses, when he talks about executives doing presentations, one of the probably most popular talks, or probably, I think if I remember right, I think I've heard him say that it is the most popular talk that he has on there, or at least one of them, that talks about sorting and labeling and how you sort and label content, how you chunk that content so that you can lead people through a presentation, so you can lead people through a talk, so you can lead people through a course. I mean, to me, these concepts are all the same. The difference is just scope, and at what level you're dealing. So at a high level, we could talk about outcomes as it relates to entire programs or curricula. If we step lower, we could talk about we have the course in the middle. We step lower, we could talk about it related to individual lectures or talks. And then if you really want to go to an even smaller level, something that's quite popular right now in higher education and education in general is this idea of badging, right? So essentially, to me, it's the de-evolution or the deconstruction of a particular course into the individual knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I think this is really the crux of what education is about. Is it's not about what courses you've taken. It's about the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you have. And so badging is a mechanism to acknowledge the level of competency you have relative to an individual skill, an individual knowledge, capability, that kind of thing, right? And that's what badging is about. It's an ability to deconstruct, because, I could say I took course X, but course X at one institution may not include the same knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I mean, there's going to be some overlap, but there may be differences. And so this idea of badging is the same idea. But still, the badge is going to be based upon usually around a single, what I would call an objective. Now, again, there are different people that would, there are people that would probably disagree with me in this kind of way I'm talking about, but this is the way I wrap my brain around it to understand. And to me, the crux of all this is really this idea of being able to write a single solitary objective that is accurate and well written, that has a goal, a purpose. It has an activity or how you're going to get there. And to me, it's all about alignment. So hopefully this becoming a mishmash at this point, but hopefully this makes sense to you. And to me, this is what drives curricular design. This is what drives good course development. To me, this is what drives good lecturing when you're actually trying to present a particular topic in any kind of talk. So hopefully you found this useful. So we've talked about, why do objectives matter? What are they? What are the scope and how many, and then kind of how they apply overall. So hopefully you're finding this content useful. We're going to continue the teaching assistant series for a little bit because I still have a couple more topics. Right now, as I'm recording this is at least at Purdue, this is the week before classes begin. And so there's a heck of a lot of ramp up for all of the graduate students as well as faculty. Everybody's bustling around, hustling their butt to try to get stuff ready for the fall semester. And hopefully we will have a relatively normal fall semester. So with that, I hope you are doing well, that you're being successful, that you are growing, that you're expanding, and most importantly, that you suck less. Have a great day.